40 male philosophy professors and 4 female. They've gotten a little bit better. Now it's 36 male and 7 female in the philosophy department. And theology is just as bad. 24 male theologians, 4 female theologians. So, but I wanted a bigger perspective than that little perspective. So I talked to the American Academy of Religion this morning. And because I wanted to find out in terms of their membership, like that's an academic organization that not just professors, but any researchers can belong to. And the numbers are actually a lot better. It's only 60% male and 39.99% female and 0.1% intersex. And I was actually kind of impressed that they're taking that statistic at this point. So, but a little bit more anecdotal evidence. I checked at Rutgers. Rutgers is pretty imbalanced in terms of religion and philosophy, but Montclair has more women doing theology, religion than men. In general, historically, women have been underrepresented in my area, but it looks like maybe changing.
Professor DeMarco?
Philosophy is pretty bad, and it's a well-known thing, but one of the reasons why we know that it's bad is because of advances that have been made. So, for example, the main organization of philosophy in North America is the American Philosophical Association, and they have 3 conferences, regional conferences a year. There is a standing committee of the organization called the Status of Women in the Profession, and this committee has existed since the late 70s. And they have produced reports, they have done investigations, and they have come up with concrete ways in which, for example, affirmative action can be applied to women in jobs, because that's the main way you get jobs in the field of philosophy is through the APA. You do your first interviews there, etc. They have ensured even things like, for example, a lot of interviews when you go to the conferences used to occur in hotel rooms. And I remember hearing this from my female philosopher friends, that you'd have 10 males around you and you were basically, there weren't enough seats because you were in a hotel room and you were sitting on a bed and there's all these men around you. I mean, it's not exactly a comfortable situation to do an interview. All that has changed. The field is still dominated by men. Now, it also depends upon which branch of philosophy. You go to a logic conference, 99.5% men. You go to, in my field, aesthetics, for example, it's almost balanced. My field of aesthetics, for example, the American Society for Aesthetics has a feminist caucus. I'm a member of it. They have their own events. They also make sure that there is representation of women in every conference that the organization has. So there has been improvement. There still needs to be more. There's still a gross imbalance. More men than women in philosophy is not representative of our population. In part, also, the APA has been trying to get women to be interested in the field, to come into it, etc.
Professor Harlan?
Yes. So in psychology, it's interesting. I don't have some of the statistics, but I know that it's really interesting that you pointed out the difference with the logic versus other areas, because I think in psychology it's somewhat similar. I think overall I would say it's actually probably more women than men in terms of various areas going into it. And probably more split when you get to like the professor, like people with doctorate, that sort of level. But then if you get like before that, like people going for counseling, because I went for a master's in counseling, and in our counseling program, for example, there were maybe like 3 guys and like 30 girls. So it was almost the other side, that other kind of balance, maybe of it being more this like caretaking type of profession that people associate it with. While certain other areas, like let's say I was going for something more neuroscience related, might be more of the opposite, because it has that science background. So it really would depend on what area that you're looking towards. And then also, same thing with the American Psychological Association. I don't know that much, but I do know they also have a very similar like woman in the field sort of area of representation, to try to give a voice to areas where they're underrepresented and get the word out. And there's various psychological journals looking at women's studies in psychology, gender issues in psychology, things like that. What's interesting though that made me think of this is, and there's no one representing this area here, is I wanted to say it's interesting when people choose their field. I'm starting, this has nothing to do with psychology, but I'm starting to look into doing things about computer programming and sort of learning some of that realm. And that's a realm, since we have no one here, that really doesn't have a lot of female representation. And so, you know, it's interesting that certain areas really get, you know, almost oversaturated, and then others, it's really hard to get people to do it. So.
That's what you think.
Much like philosophy, history is a little bit more woman-friendly than philosophy. But I just came back from a conference. I was really kind of surprised. I just came back from the Oral History Association conference. And as a discipline, oral history has a lot of women in it. A lot of the panels were predominantly women, or very even gender distribution. But oral history as a discipline is something I think that is perceived to lend itself more readily to traditional feminine attributes of listening and talking and hearing, and you know, and it's an interactive process in creating this history. So I think that you do see in that subdiscipline, you do see a lot more women. Whereas you go to a military history conference or history of medicine or something like that, you know, or among historians of antiquity or whatever, you know, you're going to get more men. It's interesting that the leadership of a lot of these organizations is frequently female. In fact, my PhD advisor is now the president of the American Historical Association, which is our largest organization. And she was also past president of the Organization of American Historians. So we do see, you know, women in leadership positions in those organizations, caucuses for women. And historians were really some of the first people out of second wave feminism to really sort of tackle the academy and getting more women into higher ed and developing women's studies programs and women's history programs. And so, you know, we do see a pretty good number of women in the field. But again, I mean, I think when I look at some of my older colleagues, it's most, you know, it's heavy on the men, a little bit lighter on the women. So it's not, and in my own department, we have 8 tenured faculty members and 2 of them are women. So.
Professor Rolston?
I was just thinking because as people were talking, I was trying to jot down the males versus females in our department. And I had all these statistics, which I forgot to print out apparently, so I don't have them with me regarding a national level. But I think that as our department is represented, we probably have maybe 10 males, and I have a lot of colleagues here, so they can kind of verify this for me. We have maybe 10 males and I would say 15 to 20 females. So we tend to have more in our department in the English area, the comp and lit area. As I think about national organizations, again, if you go to MLA, it's predominantly males, but you do have a large number of females, and you have females who are in various areas. I mean, one of the things that happens, I think, in terms of literature, if we just think about it on a broader spectrum beyond academia, is that the publishing industry is still male-dominated. And so they really control the voice in terms of what's published and what's not published. So you have a number of female writers, there's no question about that. And women writing about in various genres. But I think overall, if we look at literature, if we look at English studies, women are concentrated in certain fields. So you might have more women who are teaching composition as opposed to composition or literature. I think that men still, overall men are more prominent in academia, and also they have the tenure track jobs more frequently. It's women, men do, so it's women who might be on tenure track lines or not be tenured at all. And so I think that in the area of English studies, it's a little bit different than other areas, because in some ways women are relegated to certain kinds of subject matter. Obviously, if you're teaching a women in literature course, then it's likely to be a woman, but it could be a man. But if you have some other specialization, it just varies as to whether you will be tenured or non-tenured, or whether you will be in a university setting versus some other kind of setting. So I think that, in terms of English studies, there are a lot of factors at play. You have a lot of writers who also are in the academy. That's the way in which some writers support themselves or add to additional funds to their living. So that it's a little bit different, I think, because you have professional writers who are also in the academy, often in distinguished positions. Maya Angelou was one who just passed last year, I think, in 2014. But many writers supplement their income by being in the academy, and then they are the distinguished. And they're often male, but there are some females. So, I can't give you a definitive answer in terms of overall what we would say about the male versus female. It's mostly anecdotal. But I think that it's pretty evident that men still are the ones who are more prominent in terms of the literature in particular, not necessarily English studies, but certainly in terms of literature.
Now moving on to the next question. Has feminism progressed over time? And if so, how? Does feminism have the same power it had in the past today? Does it have any power at all? We'll start with Professor Rolliston.
I think that this, certainly the first part of the question, clearly I think feminism has progressed over time. We're in the third wave of feminism. I think that certainly from the second wave of the 70s,